envoy who helped broker the deal. President-elect Donald Trump chooses a skeptic of COVID lockdowns to lead the National Institutes of Health, a further sign of major shifts in key governmental agencies. And lacking enough manpower to push back Russia's invasion, Ukraine resorts to harsh means to force draft dodgers into combat.
Major funding for the PBS NewsHour has been provided by...
In 1995, two friends set out to make wireless coverage accessible to all. With no long-term contracts, nationwide coverage, and 100% US-based customer support. Consumer Cellular. Freedom calls.
A successful business owner sells his company and restores his father's historic jazz club with his son. A Raymond James financial advisor gets to know you, your passions, and the way you bring people together. Life well planned.
The Charles F. Kettering Foundation, working to advance inclusive democracies. Learn more at kettering.org.
The Judy and Peter Bloom Kovler Foundation, upholding freedom by strengthening democracies at home and abroad. The Walton Family Foundation, working for solutions to protect water during climate change so people and nature can thrive together. Supported by the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, committed to building a more just, verdant, and peaceful world. More information at macfound.org. And with the ongoing support of these institutions. This program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome to the NewsHour. The ceasefire between the Israeli and Lebanese governments, and including the militant group Hezbollah that went into effect early this morning, appears to be holding. And for the first time in nearly 14 months, residents on both sides of the border are heading back to their homes rather than running from bombs. Nick Schifrin speaks to the American negotiator who helped secure the deal, but first he reports on the situation on the ground today.
Today in southern Lebanon, a rare and precious feeling, hope. Families displaced by 14 months of war rush to return home. And Lebanese soldiers rush to the country's borders, the first step to implementing the ceasefire. In Hezbollah's stronghold in southern Beirut, a celebration amidst destruction. They say the U.S.-designated terrorist group ended the war with victory, but at great cost. The UN says Israeli airstrikes damaged or destroyed nearly 25,000 homes.
I have no other place to stay, so I'm forced to do this. We say that as long as we are safe, everything can be compensated.
On the Israeli side of the border, soldiers today patrolled through areas no longer under rocket fire. And inside Lebanon, Israeli commanders plan to withdraw, also claiming a form of victory, having killed most of Hezbollah's leadership and removed Hezbollah's weapons as recently as last night from near the border. But for the more than 60,000 Israelis who fled their homes last October, some have nothing to return to, and they feel skeptical the ceasefire can hold.
We are afraid that Hezbollah will start again with forces.
The agreement calls for Israel's withdrawal and the Lebanese Armed Forces' deployment to conclude within 60 days, alongside Hezbollah moving its fighters north of the Litani River, which on average is about 17 miles north of the border. To discuss the ceasefire, I'm joined by Amos Hochstein, President Biden's special envoy who led the negotiations. Amos Hochstein, thanks very much. Welcome to the NewsHour. It's been about a day since you announced this ceasefire. Is it holding so far?
So far it is holding. A couple of little things here and there, but to be expected on day one. I think most importantly, at about 9 p.m. our time last night, 4 a.m. local time, people woke up for the first time in almost 14 months without bombardments, raids, sirens, drones, etc. So I think for most of the people living in South Lebanon and northern military action. That is the goal of Israel, that's the goal of Lebanon, and is certainly the goal of mechanism that we will be chairing.
You've been mentioning the Lebanese Armed Forces, known as the LAF. They will have to secure southern Lebanon, indeed all of Lebanon's borders, with some 10,000 forces. But as you know, LAF officials have long said they don't have the resources to be able to do that. How will you help get them?
Yeah, so I think if you see the agreement, what I tried to do is, in this document, is to learn the lessons from the mistakes that were made in 1701 that you referenced at the beginning of the top of the show. There was no implementation, and it called for things that I believe, even at the time, were not realistic. It called for 15,000 LAF Lebanese army troops, not possible. This, therefore, the ceasefire that has gone now into effect means that nobody's shooting anymore, but the Israeli military is still in Lebanon. They will withdraw in phases, so you'll start seeing them withdraw within the next 2 weeks as the Lebanese army advances to the south and deploys there. The reason for that is what you said. They do not have the capacity to deploy 10,000. So what I see happening is about 5,000 Lebanese troops will be deployed to the south in the coming 60 days. And then in the several months after that, we'll do additional recruits and training of more troops to be able to go down south and get from 5,000 to 7,000 to 8,000, etc. Probably will take over a year, maybe 2 years to get to 10,000.
Beyond that question of capability, though, I want to go beyond that and ask about political will, political maneuverability for the Lebanese armed forces, given Hezbollah's political strength, given the sectarian nature of the army. Will the LAF really be able to take on Hezbollah?
You talked about earlier that the big difference is the mechanism. I would say there's one other big difference. The end of the war in 2006, Hezbollah arguably fought Israel to a draw. That's not the case here. Hezbollah is extremely weak at the moment. It has lost a significant part of its capacity, its military capacity, its political capacity. Its leadership has been decimated. Its 30-something year leader, Nasrallah, is dead. His successor is dead. Much of the leadership that has been there for the last several decades are no longer there. So there is a moment of opportunity here for Lebanon to actually, for other parts of Lebanon to rise up and establish the sovereignty of the state, the strength of the state, and that's what we intend to help together with the French and other allies to help the Lebanese do. And then we're going to try to do it not just supporting the LAF and resources they need and the equipment they need, but also to support the economy of Lebanon to rebuild and return to prosperity.
What's to prevent Iran from filling in those gaps that Hezbollah now has?
Well, they're going to try, but I would say Iran is significantly weaker today as well than they have been. And part of this agreement is we're going to try to make sure that the rearming, which happens from Iran through Syria, is
gives Republicans just a bit more breathing room as they look ahead to holding a razor-thin majority in the House come January. The final undecided race is in California. 3 Americans who've been imprisoned in China were released today in a rare diplomatic breakthrough with Beijing in the waning months of the Biden administration. One of them is Kai Li, seen here in a photograph held up by his son. He had been jailed since 2016, accused of spying. John Lee Young was sentenced for espionage last year. The third, Mark Sweden, was sentenced to death on drug charges. On a separate but related note, the State Department lowered its travel warning to China today, saying Americans should, quote, exercise increased caution when traveling to the mainland. The previous guidance had been to reconsider travel altogether. The U.S. denounced sanctions today on 21 allies of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. That comes nearly 4 months after he claimed victory in the country's highly disputed presidential election. The sanctions target military and cabinet officials aligned with Maduro. They come a week after the Biden administration recognized opposition leader Edmundo Gonzalez as the nation's president-elect. He fled for exile in Spain 2 months ago. Ohio's governor has signed into law a measure that would ban transgender students from using multi-person bathrooms that fit their gender identities. The new law says public and private schools must have separate facilities for the exclusive use of males and females based on their assigned gender at birth. Ohio joins at least 11 other states who have similar such bathroom laws. 24 states have measures that dictate which sports transgender women and girls can play. 26 states have laws restricting or banning gender-affirming care for transgender minors. On Wall Street today, stocks slipped ahead of the Thanksgiving break. The Dow Jones Industrial Average fell more than 100 points, or about a third of 1%. The Nasdaq also shed more than 100 points. The S&P 500 snapped a 7-session winning streak, giving back about 20 points. In South Korea, the biggest snowstorm in more than 50 years blanketed the nation's capital. Up to 10 inches of snow fell in parts of Seoul and nearby areas. Hundreds of flights were canceled, and icy conditions disrupted traffic. But many seemed happy with the weather, including a pair of giant panda twins at a Korean zoo. They're seeing snow for the first time in their young lives. And before putting turkey on the table, millions of Americans will first need to navigate the Thanksgiving travel rush, which is expected to be the busiest ever. TSA was prepared to screen 2.9 million people at airports across the country today. They're expecting even more on Sunday when people return home. Car traffic also clogged highways this afternoon, but forecasters say it should be smooth sailing for those who plan to hit the road tomorrow. And perhaps no one will be further from home this Thanksgiving than these NASA astronauts. They showed off their holiday fare ahead of tomorrow's feast.
We're thankful for zero gravity. It's fantastic. And of course, in a personal sense, our family, our friends, those that are lifting up prayers for us and have been, we're grateful for that. We're grateful for a nation that is a spacefaring nation that lets us live free, say what we think is important to say, and so many other things.
Butch Wilmore and Sonny Williams have been on the International Space Station since June, months longer than expected because of safety concerns with Boeing's Starliner capsule. Their families will certainly be thankful for their safe return, which is expected in February of next year. Still to come on the NewsHour, how Donald Trump's re-election fits into a broader acceptance of authoritarian leadership. Judy Woodruff explores how psychology can help bridge our divisions this Thanksgiving. And a new exhibit highlights the intersection of art and the brain.
This is the PBS NewsHour from
runs the Pandemic Center at Brown University's School of Public Health. Jennifer, so good to have you back on the program. So, Bhattacharya is tasked with running the NIH, the nation's preeminent biomedical research organization. What do you make of this pick?
Well, it's a really controversial pick for a few reasons. The first one is that typically the people tapped to lead this organization are people who have a long history of doing clinical research, or maybe they've spent a long time working in laboratories doing laboratory research. Dr. Bhattacharya is an economist, and he is trained as a medical doctor, but he is an economist and he works more on policy. So that's one way that's controversial. And then, of course, the second area of controversy is what you referenced, which is that during the COVID-19 pandemic, he was a really outspoken critic. He was one who really questioned a lot of issues, and for that, I think people sort of worry whether his approach to this job will be driven by dogma versus evidence.
I mean, I went back and reread the Great Barrington Declaration, and in hindsight, there is a part of it that does have some grains of truth, and that was the low risk that COVID posed to young people, and the larger risk of keeping them out of school for so long. I mean, when you, again, hindsight is always 20/20, but when you look at that, how do you look at his COVID advocacy at the time?
Yeah, I mean, there are some things that I agree with him on. I think calling out school closures as being particularly harmful is something I very much agreed with him on. Obviously, it's also true that those who are at advanced age were always at greatest risk of experiencing severe illness if they became infected with COVID. So those points he was, quite right on. I think what was quite challenging about the Great Barrington Declaration was that it proposed that we sort of only sequester people who are high risk and just sort of let everybody else go out, potentially to get infected. And, even if you thought that was a reasonable idea, it was just impractical because there was no way to truly sequester people who were high risk. So, that's where the real controversy comes from. But, at the end of the day, it was quite hard to figure out what was the right thing to do. And, people of all sorts, and myself included, didn't get everything right.
Right, it's a novel virus, that's why they call it that. At the NIH, when you're in charge of marshaling the federal government's enormous resources and deciding what to focus on and what not to focus on, what's the concern there with someone like him at the helm of that organization?
Well, so the concern for anyone tapped for this position, and it is a really important position. The NIH is a critically important agency for the U.S. It's the place where if you have a loved one with a rare disease or someone with cancer, it's where you're going to look for cures. So it is critically important for the nation's health. It's also critically important as a driver of the U.S. economy. And for every dollar that NIH spends, it contributes about 2.5 times that in terms of economic activity. So it is a really important economic driver, as well as the place where people are hoping for cures. We want anyone who's going to lead the agency to do so driven by evidence, not dogma. We want them to fulfill the obligations of the responsibility of the role, and not necessarily out of, some kind of perceived loyalty to the person who appointed them. That is true for everyone. And, it is my hope that as a physician and as a researcher, that Dr. Bhattacharya will be driven by evidence. He does have scientific training and he has done scientific research. And so it's my hope he will use that scientific mind to look at the evidence and make decisions about the running of that organization and its outcomes as the evidence drives him, not due to personal grievances or any perceived dogma or biases.
When you look at him within the constellation of Trump's other selections, obviously we have RFK Jr. at the very top of that pyramid. He has been a wellspring of misinformation about vaccines. Dr. David Weldon, the former congressman to run the CDC, he has also falsely linked vaccines and autism. Dr. Marty McCary to run the FDA, along with several others. When you look at this suite of individuals who will be running the nation's health policy, what is your overall sense of how this is going to go?
So my biggest worry is really about the nomination for the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services, and that is Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Compared to the other nominees, he is really in a class all by himself. Whereas I have some disagreements with some of the other nominees, these are people who have training in the areas that they are going to be potentially overseeing. They are people who have engaged considered wacky in many instances. I mean, some of his views are just simply very strange. So I am quite worried because the head of HHS is the boss of all of these individuals. And so, even if you have good people with good training and incredible scientific minds at the helm, the question is always, what are they going to be able to do, given the fact that the person who may potentially run the Department of Health and Human Services really is one who is prone to favor conspiracy theories over actual evidence.
Jennifer Nuzzo at Brown University School of Public Health, as always, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Today, a U.S. official said Ukraine should consider dropping the age of eligibility for military conscription from 25 to 18 years old. It is a stark acknowledgement that Ukraine simply doesn't have enough troops to fight the seemingly endless volume of Russian soldiers, especially now that they're being bolstered by North Korean troops. Special correspondent Jack Hewson looks at Ukraine's dilemma and the country's sometimes harsh solutions.
The promise of excitement, thrill, and adventure. This ad is one of hundreds designed to appeal to young Ukrainians to sign up to fight. But some are not well suited for the role. Anton is one of them.
I'm a pacifist, so I avoid any violence, and I can imagine now that I will shut myself up. But if I have the option to go to the war or go to the jail, I will choose to go to jail.
Others have chosen to leave the country. These men were caught trying to cross a river into neighbouring Hungary by night on an inflatable dinghy. Dozens have been drowned or rescued after attempting to swim. Many were smuggled out of the country in the back of vehicles. Rather than join them, for now, Anton is simply going to find them.
I have to look around all my actions, locked. I don't use any bus, metro, wanted to avoid a situation where I stay alone on the street.
And he does this because young men are increasingly being stopped in public spaces by recruitment officers. As Ukraine's casualties have mounted, a new law has mandated all men over 25 to update their contact details so they may be called on to replace.
If I were Ukrainian wishing to avoid military service, then this would be a very hazardous place to be. Territorial recruitment officers can approach me and ask to see my documents, and if they're not in order, I can be summoned. If I refuse to be summoned, the only person who legally is supposed to be able to detain me is a policeman, but in reality, territorial recruitment officers have been bundling men into the back of vehicles and sending them off to training centres, and then on to the front. Scores of videos of men being dragged off of the street have emerged on social media, and there are many more who have been deceived in other ways. Mikhailo, speaking to me independently of the military chain of command at his new base in Donbass, was tricked into driving straight to a training camp when he voluntarily updated his details at a medical commission.
Before they took me to car, they was very polite. They smiled at me and they said, okay, no, don't worry, it's just 2 hours. And when I sit to their car, it's like, I was like a lizard.
So how did that make you feel? You must have been very angry.
Yeah, I was confused, angry, and lost about this. Because they even didn't give me time to go home to kiss my wife, to kiss my baby.
Compounding this anger has been arrest footage of government officials with literal piles of cash allegedly harvested from draft dodging scams. This woman, Tatiana Krupov, is a regional medical commissioner accused of taking bribes to certify individuals as disabled, enabling civilization drive is still attracting recruits, like Hussein Khan, here trained to be a drone pilot in the eastern city of Harlem.
Basically, we have two choices. Either we don't fight and we all die one way or another. Russia will attack us, they will kill us, rape us. The other choice is to join the military and fight. And then we have the chance to win and have a safe life. So for me, the choice is obvious.
But there aren't enough young men and women now making this choice. At the beginning of the war, hundreds of thousands volunteered, and now the majority are drafted, some against their will. On the front line, the lack of key recruits is sorely felt. We visited an artillery unit into Chazov Yar to ask what is most severely needed. Ammunition shortages are a major problem in the face of Russia's advance. But troop shortages are just as critical, in particular an acute lack of infantry.
Can you feel any difference from the recruitment drive?
No, we don't know where the newly mobilized people are. Almost nothing has changed for us. They don't add people to help you, yet they may even take some from here instead.
Many of those on the front are close to exhaustion. Some haven't had a break since they first signed up when Russia invaded in 2022. Andriy dutifully told us that morale was high, but his face seemed to tell a different story.
We feel that fatigue from this war, but if we give up, then the situation will be far worse than it is now. But yes, we are tired. We're all so fed up with this war.
And so Kyiv's glossy recruitment campaigns continue, as the country seeks desperately to persuade young men and women to replace the thousands who have been killed and injured, fending off a far bigger invading force. For PBS NewsHour, I'm Jack Houston.
President-elect Donald Trump ran a lot of his campaign promising retribution for his enemies and asking absolute loyalty from his supporters. Now, as he prepares for a second term in office, Laura Barone-Lopez has a look at what that might mean for the future of U.S. democracy.
William, according to the Associated Press, 55% of voters said they were very or somewhat concerned that Trump would steer the U.S. toward becoming an authoritarian country, one where a single leader or small group has unchecked power. Still, more than 1 in 10 of those voters supported him anyways. To discuss this further, I'm joined by Jason Stanley, professor of philosophy at Yale University and author of Erasing History: How Fascists Rewrite the Past to Control the Future. Professor Stanley, thank you so much for joining. Why did voters on one hand acknowledge and express fear that the country could very well tip towards authoritarianism under Trump, but then on the other hand, still vote for him?
The idea that democracy is a value upon which voters vote or place enormous priority on is false. Voters prize a number of things over democracy, especially voters who have regularly lived in a country where you can replace leaders and parties by elections. The idea that democracy should be a value, well, that's something that schools and universities teach. That's something we try to emphasize, but it doesn't mean that people are born that way.
President-elect Trump has openly embraced a number of strongman leaders, including Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban. Trump has also said that he would be a dictator for a day. He has expressed a desire to seek revenge against his political enemies, and he's also threatened to use the military against civilians during times of civil unrest. If Donald Trump ends up governing like a strongman, what does that mean for the future of democracy?
He will end up governing like a strongman. He generally does what he says, which is why voters consider him authentic, perhaps rightfully so. He's appointed Pete Hegseth as his defense secretary, whose writings show that he regards leftists, political opponents, university professors as the enemy, as the real enemy. So every indication we have is that he's going to rule like an authoritarian and maybe not step down from power, certainly adjust the levers of power in our very flawed democracy so that bipartisan hearing.
Professor Jason Stanley, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Just a few weeks after a divisive presidential election, millions of Americans are about to sit down with their families for Thanksgiving dinner. For those of you concerned with potentially difficult, even clashing conversations across the table, Judy Woodruff talks with social psychologist Keith Payne about identity and communication. It's part of her ongoing series, America at a Crossroads.
Keith Payne grew up in a small town in rural Kentucky, with almost entirely white residents. His family wasn't outwardly political, but they leaned conservative, like most of their neighbors. His own political beliefs began to shift when he went away to college. That made his trips home all the more difficult.
I couldn't stop getting into political arguments with my family members. I've come from a big family with a lot of diverse political views, and on the one hand, I found these conversations and arguments so infuriating, and on the other hand, I knew that they were good, reasoned people who I loved, who I was having these intense arguments with.
Payne is now a social psychologist at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He's the author of a new book, Good, Reasonable People, Psychology Behind America's Dangerous Divide, which attempts to explain why Americans feel so split over politics, and why that can feel so personal.
We get a lot of our self-esteem and self-worth from the groups that we belong to, whether it's partisan groups like Democrats and Republicans, whether it's racial and ethnic groups, whether it's religious groups, community groups. Belonging to those groups is really important to us, and so much of what we do in life is based on reassuring ourselves that we're good and reasonable people, and the groups that we belong to are good and reasonable too.
So you're saying that the psychological roots of this, the social identity roots of this, are more important than political beliefs, issues.
Most people are sort of all over the map when it comes to policies and issue beliefs. Social scientists over the last 40 or 50 years have come to realize that most people don't have what we consider a political ideology. What they have is these social identities, and that's what people keep coming back to whenever they figure out which party is my party, which candidate is my candidate.
When I grew up in rural North Carolina, conservative family, conservative views.
Jason Howard is an owner of the Cardinal Bar in Raleigh, North Carolina, a neighborhood establishment known for inventive hot dogs and tongue-in-cheek signage. Though Howard is a registered independent, he's also a supporter of President Trump. He says growing up in small-town Pittsboro, North Carolina, everyone around him was conservative. Did you think of yourself as conservative?
I didn't know that there was anything else. You know, you're kind of like, you just take on your surroundings.
program is that. Well, that's good.
We have been beneficiaries for
Take advantage of it while you can.
Well, we're going to have a hard time without you. You have a hard time without us?
So Bob's last appearance on the Fifth Estate will be this week when he hosts the show's anniversary special, The Fifth Estate, 50 Years of Truth. That is airing Friday at 9 p.m. on CBC and CBC2. And coming soon on The National, Ian's interview with Maddie Matheson, the Canadian-born chef and actor on the award-winning series The Bear. Here's a little taste of it.
Speaking of the Emmys, you gave an acceptance speech on behalf of the show.
Yeah.
Which was astounding.
Yeah.
There was a line in there where you talked about how
CBC's daily news podcast, Front Burner, takes you deep inside the stories shaping Canada and the world. New episodes come out every morning, Monday to Friday. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube.
This little guy is Pipes the cat in the arms of his new favorite human, Meredith. So Meredith is an animal welfare officer who crawled into a 45-meter-long pipe to rescue the kitten who'd managed to get into a storm drain. Meredith's daring rescue mission makes our moment.
So our dispatch line received a phone call from our local sheriff's department. They were hearing cries of what appeared to be like a cat around the area, and they thought it was in the storm drain, so they had the cover taken off of it, and we could hear the kitten meowing. So I started playing mama cat sounds from YouTube to see if I could get it to come closer. I shined my flashlight right down this tunnel, and I could see its little eyes down there. So I just decided to just crawl in the tunnel, and I was eventually able to get to it and capture it. I was scared, I'm not gonna lie, I was nervous. It was really dark, it was musty smelling, and there were so many lizards down there. I didn't have any supplies down there with me except my flashlight and my cell. So I army crawled back to the ladder and went up the ladder, and that was it. I named him Pipes. I think he's like 4 or 5 months old, so he was pretty terrified. Our vet evaluated him, and he's got a good bill of health.
Okay, in studio, we're still stuck on the lizards in the pipe there. Pipes wasn't completely thrilled to see her at the beginning, a bit aggressive, but is perfect now. See what I did there? And will be put up for adoption right after the holiday season. Thank you for being with us. You can watch anywhere, anytime on the free CBC News app and subscribe to the Nationals YouTube channel. I'm Adrienne Arsenault. Take care.